August 7th, 1944. The roads of Normandy groaned under the weight of steel and rubber. Dawn's pale light revealed endless convoys stretching across the French countryside, their headlights piercing through the morning mist like a river of fireflies flowing eastward. Dust rose in clouds as trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks thundered past shattered villages, their engines humming in a relentless rhythm that seemed to shake the earth itself. To the German officers watching from a ridge near Falaise, it was a sight both baffling and infuriating. For weeks they had sneered at the ungainly American supply lines, those convoys that looked so vulnerable, so exposed, so easy to disrupt. And yet, day after day, the columns never ended. Like veins carrying lifeblood to a growing giant, they pulsed without pause, feeding divisions that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The Germans had expected bottlenecks, shortages, and desperation. They had counted on the Americans to falter as their armor outran their supplies. It was, after all, the iron law of war. Armies march on their stomachs, and steel beasts devour more than men. But instead of stalling, the enemy surged forward with terrifying speed. From hedgerows to open plains, from Cannes to Argenton, fresh units rolled in daily, their vehicles bristling with ammunition, their soldiers well-fed, their tanks topped off with fuel. To the weary Wehrmacht, retreating across France with dwindling resources, it felt less like fighting an army and more like standing against a machine powered by some unseen force on that August morning. German General Gunther Blumentritt stared through his field glasses at the moving tide. The convoys seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, a living serpent of war. He muttered to his staff that this was not logistics as they understood it. It was something else entirely, something alien in its scale and endurance. For months, Berlin had laughed at the crude American reliance on trucks, imagining them bogged down, broken, and abandoned on clogged roads. Yet the laughter was gone now, replaced by unease, by the gnawing realization that these convoys were not faltering. They were multiplying in the smoke-stained ruins of a crossroads cafe. A squad of German infantry huddled in silence as another column rumbled past only a few kilometers away. They listened to the distant roar of engines, like the surf of an ocean that never receded. "They can't keep this up," one soldier whispered, his voice carrying more hope than certainty. His comrade shook his head, recalling the endless trains of trucks they had seen 2 days earlier, each loaded with crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, and rations packed neatly in cardboard and canvas. The Americans did not merely bring supplies. They brought them in waves, each convoy shadowed by another, as if the Atlantic itself had been poured into France. German command posts. Maps bled with red arrows marking Allied advances. Reports flooded in, fresh tanks arriving in Brittany, new divisions pressing south, and artillery batteries firing without pause. "How is this possible?" demanded one frustrated colonel. "Their columns should be stretched to breaking. Their fuel should be exhausted." Yet intelligence officers had no satisfying answer. What they did not understand was that behind every rifle and Sherman, behind every thunderous artillery barrage, stood a silent army of logistics. Drivers, mechanics, planners, and engineers. An invisible force that turned distance into an illusion and time into an ally. By the first week of August, as the Allies closed the Falaise pocket, the Germans realized they were no longer fighting soldiers alone. They were battling a system, a supply chain so vast it seemed inexhaustible. Convoys carried not only the material of war, but also the promise of inevitability. Each passing truck was another reminder that while German tanks fought with dwindling shells, American gunners would never run dry. While German infantry gnawed stale bread, American soldiers opened tins of meat and fresh bread loaves from bakeries erected behind the front. The battlefield itself seemed to echo with this imbalance. In every clash, German units struck hard but quickly found themselves overextended, starved of ammunition, their fuel tanks running dry at the worst moments. Meanwhile, the Americans, clumsy at times and inexperienced in terrain, nevertheless fought with a confidence born from abundance. They knew that behind them, stretching back to the ports of Normandy and further still to the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, was a supply chain that never slept. In the eyes of Allied soldiers, the convoys were a lifeline. Men in foxholes cheered when they saw the long lines of trucks rolling past, their sides painted with white stars. They cheered not for glamour, not for glory, but for the simple reassurance that they would not be left wanting. Cigarettes, chocolate, ammunition, medical supplies, all arrived in quantities that felt unimaginable compared to the enemy. The Germans, once proud of their precision, now found themselves haunted by chaos. Their vaunted panzer divisions sputtered, their aircraft were grounded for lack of fuel, and their artillery was muted by empty shells. Each time they struck with fury, but it was a fire that burned out quickly, leaving only ash. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to gather strength with each passing week. Convoys gave them endurance, and endurance in war is often the sharpest weapon. It was a cruel irony. The Wehrmacht, masters of blitzkrieg, had built their reputation on speed, on lightning advances that shattered enemies before they could respond. Yet in France, the roles had reversed. Now it was the Americans who moved with a relentless tempo, their tanks fueled, their divisions supplied, their advances supported by an invisible backbone of trucks that seemed to multiply like cells in a living organism. As the summer wore on, German generals began to speak of these convoys in tones of disbelief. Some dismissed them as reckless. Others marveled at their efficiency. None could deny their effect. The supply lines were not glamorous, not adorned with medals or banners, yet they broke the back of German resistance more surely than any single battle. Behind the roar of tanks and the thunder of artillery, the quiet rumble of engines on French roads was writing the true story of victory. And so, on that August morning, as columns of American vehicles rolled past shattered hedgerows, the laughter of German generals died away. What they once mocked as clumsy excess had become the very engine of defeat. For in war, the battlefield is not only where men fight and die. It is also where food, fuel, and ammunition decide the fate of nations. And in Normandy, the Americans had built a machine of supply so vast, so unrelenting, that even the hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht could only watch in silence as it ground them into retreat. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical turning point. The Allies had stormed ashore at Normandy on June 6 in the greatest amphibious assault in history, and within weeks, the beaches had become a fortress of steel and men. What had once been quiet fields and sleepy villages now roared with ceaseless activity. Bulldozers carved out depots, airstrips, and staging grounds. Massive cranes unloaded Liberty ships packed with tanks, jeeps, and supplies, each vessel disgorging the industrial might of the United States. Normandy was no longer France. It was a forward operating base for a new kind of war, for the German High Command. This was not how the war was supposed to unfold. Their armies had fought for years on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, where supply lines stretched thin and starvation was common. They believed they understood the laws of war. Armies, no matter how strong, could not sustain prolonged operations across oceans and foreign soil. In their calculations, the Americans lacked both the will and the logistical genius to maintain a continental campaign. The Wehrmacht had studied Napoleon's collapse in Russia, had seen armies crumble for lack of bread and powder, and assumed history would repeat itself. But the Germans misjudged the Americans. They mistook inexperience for weakness and abundance for wastefulness. American troops, still considered green compared to German veterans, were backed by a supply system designed not merely to match European standards, but to overwhelm them. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which relied heavily on railroads and horse-drawn wagons for logistics, the Americans had embraced the motor age. Their convoys were not auxiliary to the army. They were the bloodstream of the army. At first glance, this seemed reckless. Endless columns of trucks meant fuel consumption on a scale that boggled the mind. Each vehicle required spare parts, mechanics, and drivers. Bridges groaned under the weight, and narrow French roads seemed inadequate for the endless stream of engines and tires. German officers laughed. "They will choke themselves," one panzer commander declared. "They are feeding too many mouths. They are moving too much, too fast. They will strangle in their own traffic." And yet, week after week, the traffic did not stop. From the beaches, the Americans funneled supplies inland with astonishing speed. Warehouses sprang up behind hedgerows. Depots were organized with almost industrial efficiency, each crate marked, sorted, and dispatched. What the Germans could not yet see was that the United States had prepared for this moment years in advance. In Detroit, Ford and General Motors had transformed assembly lines into war machines, producing trucks in numbers greater than any army in history had ever commanded. In Chicago, warehouses brimmed with canned food, ammunition, and medical kits, all standardized for rapid deployment. This was not improvisation. This was doctrine. American strategists had studied the failures of past wars and understood that modern battlefields demanded mobility and constant resupply. An army stalled was an army defeated. Thus, they built a system where logistics were not an afterthought, but the very foundation of combat power. For every rifleman at the front, there were dozens of support personnel ensuring his weapon had bullets, his stomach had food, and his body had medical aid. The Germans, in contrast, entered 1944 stretched thin across multiple fronts. In the east, the Red Army surged westward with brutal momentum. In Italy, the Allies pressed northward, tying down valuable divisions. On the Atlantic coast, German garrisons awaited an invasion they knew would come but could not predict when or where. Hitler's strategic gamble, to defend everywhere, meant supplies were fragmented, scattered, and increasingly unreliable. German panzer divisions, once the cutting edge of mechanized warfare, now found themselves grounded for lack of fuel. Trains carried fewer tanks and more refugees. Horses pulled carts through mud where trucks should have rolled, and soldiers scavenged whatever they could. When the Allies finally broke out of Normandy in late July, it was not just their tanks and aircraft that shocked the Germans. It was their speed. Columns of Shermans pushed deep into France, flanking German defenses, outpacing their expectations. Every time German generals assumed the enemy would pause, the Americans pressed harder, fueled not by chance, but by a supply system designed for relentless advance. The clash of doctrines was now stark. The Wehrmacht had perfected short, decisive campaigns. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Its entire philosophy relied on rapid thrusts supported by concentrated supply lines, overwhelming the enemy before logistics could collapse. But Blitzkrieg required careful preparation, tight coordination, and most importantly, limited duration. The Americans were fighting a different war. Their convoys were not fragile arteries vulnerable to collapse. They were redundant, overlapping, and self-reinforcing. If one road was cut, another opened. If a convoy was ambushed, more convoys followed. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible. Their mindset was shaped by scarcity, by rationing, and by desperate calculation of how far fuel and ammunition could stretch. The Americans, by contrast, thought in terms of abundance, of systems built to outlast and outproduce. The difference was not just material, it was cultural. German generals had been trained to expect limits. American planners were trained to defy them. By August, as the Falaise pocket began to close, the Wehrmacht faced a nightmare they had never imagined. Their divisions were being ground down not only by combat, but also by attrition of supply. Every shot they fired was a choice. Every liter of fuel meant one more hour of mobility or none at all. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed to have no such constraints. Artillery barges thundered day and night. Airfields filled with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that refueled and rearmed with mechanical efficiency. German soldiers whispered to one another that the enemy's ammunition was endless, that his trucks were inexhaustible, and that his strength came from somewhere beyond comprehension. The truth was simple but devastating. American logistics had turned the tide. Normandy had been the test, and the breakout into France was the proof. Where the Germans saw weakness, the Allies had built their greatest strength. Where the Germans expected collapse, the Americans created momentum. And where the Germans laughed, the Americans prepared. The war was entering a new phase, one that would see the limits of German endurance tested against the full weight of Allied industry. In the fields of France, amid the smoke of burning villages and the endless roar of engines, the stage was set for a revelation. The convoys, mocked at first as clumsy excess, were about to reveal themselves as the hidden edge of victory. The German high command had long believed they understood the American war machine. To them, it was a clumsy beast, heavy-footed, over-reliant on industry, and unsophisticated in its methods. They saw the American soldier as poorly trained and dependent on machines rather than discipline. And when their scouts first reported the vast convoys winding through Normandy, laden with crates, fuel drums, and endless supplies, German generals laughed. They mocked the spectacle as wasteful, unsustainable, and vulnerable. A single air raid, one commander boasted, and the whole thing collapses. But as weeks turned into months, the laughter began to fade. The convoys did not stop. They grew. Hidden beneath the dust and diesel smoke was a secret advantage the Germans had not anticipated. It was not a single weapon, nor a sudden technological breakthrough. It was a system, vast and intricate, built on foresight and industry. The Americans had crafted a logistical doctrine unlike anything the world had seen. Where the Germans measured success in terms of tanks and guns, the Americans measured it in tonnage delivered, miles of road cleared, gallons of fuel consumed, and trucks dispatched on time. Their weapon was not merely the Sherman tank or the Thunderbolt fighter. Their true weapon was scale. Consider the trucks themselves. To the Germans, they were unimpressive, even laughable. The ubiquitous GMC CCKW, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, carried 2.5 tons of cargo. It lacked armor, lacked glamour, and seemed absurdly vulnerable on the battlefield. Yet it was everywhere. Produced by the hundreds of thousands, the Deuce and a Half became the circulatory system of the Allied armies. What it lacked in protection, it made up for in numbers. For every German supply column guarded by horses and dwindling fuel, the Americans deployed a highway of engines stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines hundreds of miles away. Fuel was the lifeblood of mechanized war. And here the hidden advantage became devastatingly clear. German panzer divisions, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, found themselves paralyzed by shortages. Hitler's armies were strangled by the Allied bombing campaign that shredded rail networks and destroyed refineries. Fuel was scarce, rationed, and fought over. Every panzer that rolled forward did so under the shadow of empty reserves. The Americans, by contrast, drowned in fuel. They had pipelines laid beneath the English Channel, pumping petrol directly into France. They had convoys of tanker trucks that moved day and night, replenishing forward depots. When a Sherman rolled into battle, its crew did not wonder if they would have enough to return. When an artillery battery unleashed a thunderous barrage, its gunners did not fear running out of shells. The hidden advantage was not only material, it was organizational. American planners had mastered the art of redundancy. They built overlapping systems so that if one convoy was delayed, another was already en route. If a depot was destroyed, 3 more stood ready. Logistics officers coordinated through radios and charts with the same precision German generals reserved for battle tactics. To the Wehrmacht, logistics was an afterthought. To the Americans, it was strategy itself. This difference baffled German commanders on the ground. Reports filtered back to headquarters of divisions that seemed to appear out of thin air. One day, German units fought exhausted GS, clinging to hedgerows. The next, fresh American regiments arrived, their uniforms clean, their weapons gleaming, their artillery fully stocked. It was as if the enemy had endless reserves waiting just beyond the horizon. "They are like locusts," one German officer complained. They never stopped coming. But it was not magic. It was logistics. Even in the air, the hidden advantage revealed itself. German Luftwaffe pilots, dwindling in number, were ordered to strike the supply columns. They did so with courage, strafing the roads, burning a handful of trucks, and scattering convoys into ditches. Yet for every truck destroyed, dozens more rolled in behind. The losses barely registered in the grand scale. American mechanics worked tirelessly, repairing vehicles, salvaging parts, and keeping the flow alive. Where German attacks were expected to collapse, they found only resilience. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers, hardened by years on the Eastern Front, were accustomed to rationing every bullet, every slice of bread. They marched on empty stomachs, fought with dwindling ammunition, and retreated when fuel ran out. To face an enemy that never seemed to lack, that ate hot meals, smoked endless cigarettes, and unleashed artillery without pause, was deeply demoralizing. The hidden advantage was not only in trucks and tonnage. It was in the morale of the men who fought with confidence that they would never be left wanting. On the American side, the convoys became a symbol of certainty. Troops at the front watched the endless stream of vehicles pass with relief. Trucks brought more than fuel and bullets. They carried letters from home, coffee in thermos cans, and medical supplies that saved lives. The convoys reminded soldiers that behind the mud and blood of France stood an entire nation, an arsenal that never slept. To German soldiers, this was incomprehensible. To Americans, it was expected. By September 1944, the scale of the hidden advantage was undeniable. German intelligence officers pored over captured documents, shocked by the sheer organization of the Allied supply system. They read reports of depots stocked with millions of rounds, fuel reserves calculated down to the gallon, and replacement vehicles waiting in neat rows. This was not improvisation. This was planning on a scale so vast that it turned war into a matter of mathematics. What had begun as ridicule transformed into fear. German generals who once sneered at the convoys now understood they were facing something more powerful than any panzer division. They were fighting a machine of industry and logistics that could not be stopped with tactics alone. Every road in France, every bridge, every depot became a weapon in itself, part of a system that stretched across oceans, across continents, connecting the factories of America to the battlefields of Europe, and so, the hidden advantage revealed itself in every clash, every retreat, and every shattered German counterattack. It was not the brilliance of a single commander nor the superiority of a single weapon, but the invisible hand of logistics that crushed the Wehrmacht's hopes. The convoys, mocked as symbols of excess, had become the very embodiment of inevitability. For the Germans, it was a bitter realization. They had built tanks that outgunned and out-armored the Sherman. They had commanders of genius, veterans hardened by years of battle. But against an enemy that never ran dry, never paused, and never hesitated, all their advantages crumbled. The hidden advantage had finally emerged, and it was not one the Wehrmacht could ever match. Engines roared in unison as an endless column of trucks crawled through the French countryside. Their headlights dimmed against the threat of night raids, their wheels grinding down the ancient cobblestones beneath them. Each vehicle looked ordinary, unremarkable, yet together they formed a logistical juggernaut that defined modern war. To understand how these convoys achieved the impossible, one must look not at the battlefield but at the blueprints, the factories, and the raw engineering that gave them life. That the heart of the Allied supply chain was the GMC CCKW, the Deuce and a Half. More than 560,000 of these trucks rolled out of American factories during the war, each designed with brutal simplicity. They carried 2.5 tons of cargo, but often hauled far more when necessity demanded. Powered by a 91-horsepower GMC straight-six engine, the CCKW could reach 45 miles per hour on roads, its rugged suspension and six-wheel drive configuration allowing it to tackle mud, snow, and uneven terrain that would cripple civilian vehicles. To a casual observer, it looked flimsy compared to a German half-track, but it was reliable, cheap, and, most importantly, replaceable. American industry treated these trucks not as luxury machines, but as tools of war. Parts were standardized across models, ensuring that mechanics in the field could swap components quickly. A broken axle in Normandy could be replaced with the same part manufactured in Detroit, shipped across the Atlantic, and delivered within days. German supply officers, by contrast, wrestled with a logistical nightmare. Their army fielded dozens of vehicle types from competing manufacturers, each requiring unique parts. A broken-down Opel Blitz or Horch-Staff car might sit idle for weeks, cannibalized for spares. The Americans never allowed such inefficiency. Their doctrine was simple: keep it moving, keep it standardized, keep it supplied. Fuel, the most vital commodity of all, was delivered through an ingenious network. Before D-Day, engineers had designed Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. Beneath the waves of the English Channel, flexible pipes pumped gasoline directly from Britain to the beaches of Normandy. From there, tanker trucks dispersed the fuel inland, feeding depots that stretched like arteries across France. The statistics were staggering. By 1945, Pluto was delivering over 1 million gallons per day. For the Wehrmacht, reliant on dwindling stocks of synthetic fuel and overextended rail lines, this was unimaginable. German panzer crews often siphoned fuel from abandoned vehicles, their once proud divisions reduced to scavenging. Americans, by contrast, treated fuel as abundant as water, and with it they sustained an advance faster than any in military history. Ammunition flowed in equally vast quantities. The American 105mm howitzer, the backbone of artillery units, fired shell after shell without pause because the convoys never let its caissons run empty. Each truckload carried neatly packed crates of shells, standardized in weight and dimensions for easy loading. German gunners, forced to ration every round, could scarcely believe the volume of fire unleashed by their opponents. Reports from the front described American artillery barges that lasted hours, the ground trembling beneath a storm of steel that showed no signs of exhaustion. Even food, the most basic of supplies, became a demonstration of American efficiency. Rations were standardized into the famous K-ration and C-ration packs, each containing carefully measured calories. Soldiers at the front could count on consistent meals delivered in mass quantities, often supplemented with luxuries like chocolate and cigarettes. German troops, by contrast, subsisted on stale bread, captured food, or thin stews. The contrast between a well-fed GI and a hungry lancer was more than physical, it was psychological. A soldier who knows his stomach will never be empty fights with confidence. Behind these convoys stood the factories of America, humming ceaselessly. Detroit, once the capital of automobiles, became the arsenal of democracy. Ford's Willow Run plant, capable of producing one B-24 bomber per hour, also churned out trucks in numbers the Germans could scarcely comprehend. General Motors, Studebaker, and Dodge all turned civilian expertise into military production. Unlike Germany, where factories were bombed relentlessly and resources stretched thin, America fought on untouched soil, its assembly lines never threatened. Its output growing with each passing month. The scale alone was overwhelming, but the genius lay in integration. Logistics was not left to improvisation. It was planned, rehearsed, and drilled with the same precision as battlefield maneuvers. Convoy schedules were mapped down to the minute. Supply officers coordinated with frontline commanders to anticipate needs before they arose. Trucks carried not only supplies, but also radio operators who relayed status reports in real time. The Germans, struggling with outdated systems, could not match this flexibility. Where their railbound logistics faltered, the Americans adapted on the move. Consider the Red Ball Express, the most famous of all supply operations. Beginning in August 1944, thousands of trucks, marked with red circular signs, roared day and night along a closed highway system reserved solely for their use. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours, feeding Patton's Third Army as it raced across France. Most of the drivers were African-American soldiers, often overlooked in combat roles but entrusted with one of the most critical missions of the war. They drove without rest, without lights at night, through mud, rain, and enemy fire, sustaining momentum that stunned the Germans. The Red Ball Express was not glamorous, but it was decisive, a triumph of engineering, coordination, and sheer determination. German officers who studied captured maps and supply charts could only shake their heads. Their doctrine had never conceived of such mobility. They had trusted in railways, efficient in peacetime, but fragile under bombardment. They had relied on requisitioning from occupied lands, a method that collapsed once the occupied turned hostile. And they had never dreamed of dedicating such resources to what they considered secondary roles. For the Americans, there was no distinction. Logistics was the lifeblood of the army, and it was given the same attention as strategy and tactics. The engineering marvel was not only in steel and rubber but also in organization itself. Each division was backed by quartermaster units, medical units, ordnance repair teams, engineers, and transportation battalions. The American Army was, in truth, a machine within a machine, soldiers in the trenches backed by armies of mechanics and planners working just as tirelessly. German generals who scoffed at rear-area troops soon realized those troops were as decisive as the men firing rifles as the convoys thundered onward. Their technical backbone revealed the stark difference between two visions of war. Germany had built brilliant tanks and powerful guns, but it had no system to sustain them. America had built ordinary trucks, standardized rations, and pipelines, and with these, it conquered continents. The Deuce and a Half was no knight in shining armor, no monstrous tiger tank. But it was everywhere, always moving, always delivering. And in modern war, the humble became mighty, and the ordinary became unstoppable. By autumn 1944, German soldiers no longer laughed when they saw the endless lines of trucks. They understood, at last, that these were not mere vehicles. They were arteries of an industrial giant, pumping life into an army that seemed inexhaustible. And in that technical precision, in that flood of supplies and fuel, lay the hidden secret of victory. September 18, 1944. The rolling farmlands near the French village of Ericourt lay wrapped in mist. The early autumn fog clinging low to the ground like a veil. German tank crews crouched in their Panthers, their engines rumbling, exhaust plumes trailing into the dawn. For days, reinforcements from the 5th Panzer Army had been ordered forward. Their mission clear: to smash through the thin American lines, to reassert control, and to remind the Allies that German armor still ruled the battlefield. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, the infantry battered, but here, in Lorraine, the Germans had numbers. 39 Panthers prepared to strike. The stage was set for a decisive clash, but the Americans were waiting. Patton's Third Army, stretched thin but never exhausted, had been fed continuously by the veins of supply convoys that reached from Normandy to the Moselle. Trucks rumbled through the night, headlights dimmed, bringing crates of 75 shells, drums of gasoline, and fresh replacements who had eaten hot meals just hours before. Where the Germans had expected to find weary, undersupplied defenders, they encountered formations that seemed perpetually ready. It was here, at Ericourt, that the hidden power of American logistics would show its teeth. As the fog lifted, the battlefield erupted. German Panthers, sleek and deadly, advanced with confidence, their 75 high-velocity guns seeking targets. They fired, shells shrieking across fields, detonating among American positions. Yet for every Sherman tank that smoldered in the hedgerows, another appeared, fueled and armed, its crew emboldened by the certainty that ammunition was plentiful and reinforcements were close behind. Artillery thundered, coordinated by radios crackling with orders. The ground shook as shells poured onto the advancing panzers, guided by observers who knew they could call for fire again and again without fear of the guns falling silent. German commanders were bewildered. Their doctrine had taught them to expect enemy artillery to slacken after a few minutes, starved of shells. Yet here, the American barges only grew stronger, rolling across the fields like a storm. Infantry units, supported by the endless supply chain, did not waver. They counterattacked with fresh grenades and with mortars that never ran dry. And from behind, convoys poured into hastily prepared depots, delivering more crates, more fuel, and more certainty. The battle raged for days. Panther after Panther was knocked out, some from direct fire, others abandoned when they ran out of fuel or ammunition. The German supply system was faltering under the pressure. Columns of trucks were harassed by Allied fighter bombers, and depots were bombed to rubble. Replacement fuel never arrived on time. Crews cannibalized damaged tanks for parts, siphoned fuel from disabled vehicles, and rationed shells with a desperation born of scarcity. Every kilometer pushed forward drained resources they could not replace. For the Americans, the story was different. Though Shermans were lost in alarming numbers, the river of supply never dried. A burned-out tank was replaced within days. A wounded unit received medical attention within hours, with plasma and bandages delivered by trucks as vital as those carrying shells. The Red Ball Express fed Patton's army with relentless speed, keeping his divisions fueled for maneuver and his artillery stocked for constant bombardment. The very mobility of the Americans, mocked by the Germans as wasteful excess, became decisive. By September 29th, the German attack had collapsed. Of the 39 Panthers that entered the battle, the majority lay wrecked across the fields of Lorraine. American losses were heavy, but the crucial difference was this: their losses could be replaced. German tank crews walked back to shattered depots, finding little more than empty fuel drums and ration boxes. American crews, by contrast, climbed into newly delivered vehicles, fueled from full drums, supplied from endless crates. German after-action reports painted a grim picture. Enemy artillery is inexhaustible, one officer wrote. Even when their tanks are destroyed, more arrive. Their convoys never cease. It is as though their resources are without limit. The Panther, once the terror of the battlefield, had been humbled not by superior firepower, but by the relentless tide of supply. Every shell, every gallon of gasoline, and every spare part delivered by the convoys became a weapon as lethal as any gun. Ericourt was more than a clash of tanks. It was proof that logistics had become the decisive factor in modern war. German armor, superior in design, could no longer compensate for the fragility of its supply lines. American armor, though outgunned, was sustained by a logistical backbone that made every setback temporary, every loss recoverable. The battle revealed a new kind of warfare, one where victory belonged not only to those who fired the most accurately, but to those who could fight the longest. For the soldiers on the ground, the difference was tangible. American infantrymen, crouched in muddy foxholes, felt reassured when convoys rolled past at night, their engines humming, their beds stacked high with supplies. They knew they could fight on. German infantrymen, shivering and hungry, looked back toward roads that no longer delivered. They knew they were fighting with their backs against emptiness. Patton himself understood the significance. He drove through the rear areas, watching the Red Ball trucks thunder eastward, and remarked that his army moved as fast as the trucks allowed. At Ericourt, that speed and abundance had turned the tide. The German offensive, ambitious on paper, had been broken not only by the courage of GS and the thunder of artillery, but also by the invisible machine of supply that ensured the Americans could endure where the Germans could not. Ericourt was just one battle, but it was emblematic of the larger truth unfolding across France. The Wehrmacht was being bled dry not only by combat but also by attrition of resources. Its panzers, brilliant machines of war, became steel coffins when their engines ran cold and their shells ran out. The Americans, with their ungainly Shermans and endless convoys, demonstrated that in modern warfare, the ability to sustain combat outweighed the ability to dominate it in a single blow. As the smoke cleared over Lorraine, the fields littered with wrecks, one truth stood out. The German generals who had once laughed at the American convoys now faced the bitter reality. It was those very convoys, ordinary trucks loaded with crates and fuel drums, that had defeated them. The autumn of 1944 revealed a truth the Wehrmacht had long refused to accept. What had once been mocked as excess had now become the iron chain that dragged Germany toward defeat. The convoys, endless and unstoppable, were more than a logistical marvel. They were a psychological weapon, grinding down enemy morale with every passing truck. To the German soldier on the front line, the sight of American abundance was as demoralizing as the thunder of artillery. To Allied commanders, it was a revelation that changed the very nature of strategy. Everywhere the German armies turned, they encountered an enemy who never seemed to tire, never seemed toe-starve, and never seemed to falter. In Normandy, they had expected the Allied beachhead to choke under its own weight. Instead, the ports bustled, the depots filled, and the roads thrummed with constant traffic. By the time the breakout into France began, the Wehrmacht understood they were facing not just divisions of men, but a living system that could not be cut apart. Each convoy was a promise, each crate a guarantee, each gallon of fuel a symbol that the Americans could keep fighting forever. Strategically, this changed everything. German counterattacks, once so devastating in their precision, now collapsed under the weight of logistics. A panzer offensive that might have shattered Soviet lines on the Eastern Front found itself smothered in France, not by superior tactics, but by the sheer endurance of the enemy. The Germans fought with fury, but every blow they landed was dulled by the simple fact that the Americans could replace what was lost. A burned Sherman was replaced with another. An exhausted regiment was reinforced with fresh troops. Artillery batteries that fired thousands of shells in a single day were resupplied by nightfall. For the first time in the war, the German high command faced an opponent who could not be bled dry. The psychological toll was immense. German soldiers who had grown used to rationing ammunition now faced artillery that never seemed to cease. They whispered bitterly that the Americans fought like gods, immune to exhaustion. "They fire without counting," one prisoner confessed. "We must count every round, every bullet, but they fire as if they have an ocean behind them. That ocean, of course, was American industry, funneled through convoys that made the front line feel bottomless. Among American troops, the impact was the opposite. Soldiers who knew they would never be left wanting fought with confidence. Convoys brought more than supplies, they brought morale. A GI could eat a hot meal, smoke fresh cigarettes, and write home on paper delivered from across the ocean. To him, the convoys were proof that he was not alone, that an entire nation stood behind him. Every crate unloaded was a whisper from home. You will not be abandoned. Commanders understood this dynamic well. Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower saw that supply was not simply a matter of logistics, but of tempo. With the Red Ball Express feeding the advance, they could move faster than the Germans ever believed possible. Blitzkrieg, once the hallmark of the Wehrmacht, had been stolen from them and reinvented in American form. German generals who had written the book on Lightning War now found themselves its victims, as American tanks raced across France, sustained not by genius, but by gasoline. Even in the halls of German high command, despair grew. Reports flowed in describing convoys that never ceased, depots that seemed dinless, and artillery that never stopped. Field Marshal von Rundstedt admitted privately that the Allies' strength lay not in their soldiers, but in their capacity to keep them supplied. He lamented that German divisions could not fight with the same confidence. Each battle drained their strength irreversibly, while the Americans seemed to fight with renewed vigor after every clash. The contrast could not have been sharper. On the German side, divisions melted away from attrition, their vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel, and their artillery was silenced for lack of shells. On the American side, the losses were real but temporary, replenished by the steady heartbeat of convoys that delivered everything from machine gun belts to medical plasma. This disparity reshaped the battlefield itself. The Germans began to hesitate, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked certainty. How could they strike an enemy who would not bleed dry? The strategic impact extended beyond the battlefield. Every failed counterattack and every collapse of German resistance accelerated the Allied advance. What might have been a slow grind through France became a relentless march. Convoys gave Eisenhower the confidence to push forward, knowing his armies could be fed, armed, and fueled no matter the distance. Bridges were repaired overnight, depots relocated with astonishing speed, and convoys rerouted through alternate roads when bottlenecks appeared. The Germans, trapped in a mindset of scarcity, could not comprehend this fluidity. Psychologically, the German generals themselves began to unravel. They had prided themselves on precision, on efficiency, on the myth of German superiority in planning. But in 1944, their plans disintegrated against the sheer mass of Allied logistics. The enemy they once mocked for clumsiness revealed a sophistication of a different kind, not elegant, not subtle, but relentless. And that relentlessness was more terrifying than any single tank or aircraft. For the German soldier crouched in a foxhole, the sound of American engines in the distance became a sound of dread. Each convoy rolling past the horizon meant fresh artillery barges tomorrow, more tanks the day after, and endless waves of infantry. For the American soldier in his own foxhole, that same sound was reassurance, the hum of survival. In war, perception is as powerful as reality, and the convoy shaped both. By the winter of 1944, this imbalance had hardened into certainty. The Wehrmacht could still fight with skill and still strike with ferocity, but they could no longer change the tide. The strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the Allies, not because of one battle, not because of one weapon, but because the convoys never stopped. They had become the invisible weapon of the war, grinding down the enemy's will, sustaining the Allies' momentum, and proving that in modern war, the greatest victories are won not only by firepower, but also by endurance. And so, as the battered German armies fell back toward the Rhine, a grim understanding spread through their ranks. They were not just losing battles. They were losing to a system, a machine of supply that could not be broken. Their laughter at the convoys was gone now, replaced by silence, by despair, by the knowledge that they faced an enemy who would never run dry. The war in Europe did not end in a single moment of collapse, but in the steady grinding away of German strength until nothing remained to resist. By 1945, As the Allies surged across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany, the lesson had become undeniable. The convoys had been as decisive as any tank, any bomber, or any infantry assault. They were the pulse of the Allied war effort, an unbroken artery connecting the factories of America to the battlefields of Europe. And in that relentless flow of trucks and supplies lay a legacy that reshaped modern warfare forever. After the surrender, German officers admitted in hushed tones what they had once refused to acknowledge. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel conceded that while Germany had built tanks superior in armor and firepower, it was the Americans who had built tanks that worked together. General Alfred Jodl described the Red Ball Express not as an improvised system, but as a rolling miracle, the like of which Germany could never have matched. Their own army, bound by railroads, rationing, and scarcity, had been outmaneuvered not by brilliance off command, but by logistics turned into strategy. The legacy of the American convoys extended beyond victory in Europe. In the years that followed, as the Cold War dawned, military planners across the world studied the lessons of 1944. They realized that tanks, planes, and soldiers were useless without the fuel, ammunition, and food to sustain them. The U.S. Army institutionalized these lessons, crafting doctrines that placed logistics at the very center of war. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, each conflict bore the imprint of Normandy's convoys, each proving anew that endurance and supply outweighed even the most advanced firepower. The Red Ball Express became a legend, not just for its technical achievement, but for what it symbolized: the willpower of a nation mobilized. Thousands of African-American drivers, long denied combat roles, carried the war forward behind the wheel. They braved rain, mud, Luftwaffe strafing runs, and exhaustion, driving without lights at night, engines howling through darkness. Their role, once overlooked, became a cornerstone of victory. It was a reminder that wars are not won solely by the men who fire the guns, but by the men who carry the weight to the front. For veterans, the memory of the convoys lingered as a symbol of certainty. Soldiers remembered the sound of engines in the night and the sight of trucks rolling endlessly past their positions. They remembered the relief of knowing that hot food, fresh ammunition, and medical care would arrive no matter how far they advanced. Many who returned home spoke not only of battles, but of the invisible lifeline that had sustained them. Families of those who served in the Red Ball Express carried pride in the knowledge that their loved ones had fueled the liberation of a continent. For historians, the legacy was stark. The German generals who had laughed at the American convoys had misunderstood the future of war. They believed in decisive battles, in brilliant maneuvers, and in weapons that outmatched the enemy's. But the Americans had written a new chapter. They showed that in an industrial war, the true measure of strength was not the sharpness of the spear, but the depth of the arm that hurled it. It was not enough to strike hard. One had to strike without end. The convoys also left a lasting impression on military technology. The lessons of standardized parts, mass production, and redundancy became guiding principles for armies worldwide. NATO, formed after the war, was built on the very foundation of integrated logistics, ensuring that Allied armies could fight together, supplied seamlessly across borders. Even in modern conflicts, the shadow of Normandy's convoys looms large. From the deserts of the Middle East to the mountains of Afghanistan, supply chains remain the deciding factor between victory and collapse. And yet, beyond the numbers, beyond the engineering and strategy, the legacy of the convoys lies in a simple truth: they embodied endurance. They proved that an army could be more than a force of destruction. It could be a machine of perseverance. Every truck, every driver, every crate carried across France was a testament to a nation's commitment to see the war through to the end. In that endurance, the Americans found their greatest strength. That be why the time the guns fell silent in May 1945. Germany was in ruins, its army shattered, and its generals defeated not only by force of arms, but also by a relentless tide of supply that had never ceased. The laughter that once echoed in their headquarters had been silenced forever. In its place was a grudging respect and a bitter recognition. They had underestimated the humble truck, the ordinary convoy, and the unglamorous lifeline that had carried an army to victory. The story of the convoys is the story of modern war. It is the reminder that glory on the battlefield is built on sweat in the rear, that heroism at the front depends on sacrifice behind the lines. It is the lesson that in war, as in life, abundance is strength, and endurance is victory. And so the final image remains: the roads of France in 1944 stretching to the horizon, filled with trucks painted with white stars, their engines roaring, their cargo beds stacked high with the lifeblood of war. To the Germans, they were once a joke. To history, they were destiny. For in modern war, connection outweighs firepower and speed defeats armor. And the convoys that never stopped coming carried not just supplies, but the weight of a world that refused to yield until freedom was won.